On a luxury honeymoon cruise, romance turned into a nightmare when newlywed George Smith vanished under chillingly suspicious circumstances. A bloodstain, conflicting testimonies, and unanswered questions left his family fighting for justice. Was it accident, murder, or cover-up? This haunting mystery at sea will hold you until the very end. In July 2005, the Mediterranean was alive with summer's glow. Cruise ships dotted the seas, carrying thousands of passengers chasing a dream of luxury, romance, and escape from everyday life. Among them were George Allen Smith IV and his bride, Jennifer Hagel Smith, who had embarked on their honeymoon aboard Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Seas. For the young American couple, both in their mid-20s, this was supposed to be the beginning of a lifelong journey together. Yet within days, what began as an idyllic celebration of love would transform into one of the most haunting mysteries to ever unfold at sea. George Smith was a man people noticed. At 26, he carried an air of confidence and charm, the kind that seemed effortless. He was the son of a successful Connecticut businessman who owned a popular liquor store chain. George had grown up in comfort, shielded by wealth but never detached from the warmth of family life. Friends described him as magnetic and adventurous, a man who craved excitement and never shied away from a good time. When he met Jennifer Hagel, he had found someone who matched his energy in some ways but contrasted in others. Jennifer, just 25, was refined and graceful. She had ambitions in the beauty and wellness industry, and her personality was described as both elegant and determined. She wasn't loud or flamboyant like George, but she had her own presence, one of quiet sophistication. Their union, celebrated in a beautiful wedding earlier that summer, looked perfect from the outside. Together, they represented the image of young love, setting out to discover the world hand in hand. Their honeymoon cruise, spanning ports across the Mediterranean, was to be their first great adventure as husband and wife. But as is often the case with outward perfection, cracks began to show beneath the surface. Passengers and staff aboard the Brilliance of the Seas would later recall tensions between the couple. George enjoyed late nights, drinking, gambling, and engaging with strangers who shared his appetite for adventure. Jennifer, while social, often preferred quieter moments, and those differences occasionally spilled into arguments. Still, no one could have predicted how quickly a romantic honeymoon would descend into tragedy. As the cruise moved between ports in Turkey, Greece, and Italy, George and Jennifer spent their evenings in the casino, the ship's bars, and the late-night lounges. They were not alone. Among their new acquaintances were a small group of young men, mostly in their 20s, who were known for their wild behavior. These included Josh Askin, a college-aged Californian, and two Russian-American men, Rusty Kaufman and the Rosenberg cousins. The group was loud, heavy drinking, and often rowdy, but George seemed drawn to their energy. Witnesses would later describe nights of high-stakes gambling, shots of alcohol flowing freely, and a camaraderie built on reckless indulgence. On the evening of July 4, 2005, the cruise ship hosted its usual round of entertainment. Music filled the decks, passengers mingled, and the casino buzzed with activity. George and Jennifer were among the crowd, drinking heavily as they joined their newfound companions. Multiple witnesses later noted that the couple appeared to argue at points during the night, tensions flaring between George's exuberant partying and Jennifer's growing frustration. Yet, like many young couples, they seemed to reconcile quickly, laughing again as the night wore on. As midnight passed, the alcohol continued to flow. The group of men George had been gambling with encouraged him to keep drinking, and Jennifer, by then visibly exhausted, began to fade from the scene. Witnesses recalled seeing her looking frustrated, perhaps even embarrassed, by George's intoxicated state. Around 2 a.m., security cameras caught glimpses of the group moving between the casino, bars, and cabins. Passengers in nearby hallways would later report hearing raised voices and loud noises, suggesting that arguments and chaos followed the group wherever they went. By 4 a.m., the situation reached a breaking point. Jennifer was discovered by crew members passed out in a hallway, apparently too intoxicated to make it back to her cabin. Security staff, used to dealing with drunken passengers, escorted her safely back to the couple's room. She collapsed onto the bed, unaware that it would be the last time she would see her husband. George, however, did not return. The morning of July 5th began like any other aboard the Brilliance of the Seas. Passengers awoke to the sight of the Greek coast as the ship continued its voyage. Yet the illusion of calm shattered quickly. Crew members noticed something unusual on one of the ship's lifeboats. A massive, smeared bloodstain stretched across the white canopy. Directly above it was the balcony belonging to George and Jennifer's cabin. Alarm spread quickly. The obvious conclusion was inescapable. Someone had gone overboard. When Jennifer awoke, groggy and disoriented, she found herself alone in the cabin. Her husband was missing. Panic set in as crew members, now investigating the bloodstain, began piecing together the grim possibility that George had fallen, or been pushed, from the balcony during the night. Royal Caribbean staff initially tried to maintain order, but whispers raced through the ship. A young newlywed had disappeared under circumstances that seemed anything but accidental. News of the disappearance spread rapidly, first among passengers and then to authorities. The ship, docked in Turkey at the time, became the center of an international investigation. Turkish officials boarded to question witnesses, while Royal Caribbean management prepared statements that emphasized the possibility of an accident. But the sheer volume of blood discovered below the balcony suggested something more violent. For many, it looked less like a drunken fall and more like the aftermath of a struggle. Passengers stepped forward with their accounts. Some claimed they had heard shouting and banging noises coming from the Smiths' cabin during the early morning hours. Others reported seeing the group of young men escorting George toward his room. A few even claimed they overheard boasts or cryptic remarks from those same men the following day, suggesting knowledge of what had happened. Despite this, the details remained frustratingly unclear. Jennifer, devastated, faced suspicion from some quarters. Their marriage, after all, had shown signs of strain, and questions swirled about whether their arguments that night had escalated. Investigators pressed her for answers, but she insisted she had no knowledge of what happened once she was escorted back to the cabin. To her, George had simply never returned. The disappearance shocked not only the Smith family back in the United States but also the broader public. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a chilling mystery aboard a honeymoon cruise. Here was a young man, celebrating love and new beginnings, who vanished into the sea under suspicious circumstances. And yet, in a place filled with surveillance cameras, security staff, and hundreds of passengers, no one could provide a definitive account of what happened. For George's parents and relatives, grief quickly turned into determination. They demanded answers, pushing for accountability not only from the cruise line but also from international authorities. The blood evidence, the inconsistencies in witness testimony, and the lack of transparency from Royal Caribbean all fueled suspicions that the truth was being hidden. What should have been a simple investigation into an accidental fall became mired in competing narratives, conflicting jurisdictions, and lingering doubts. And so, by the time the Brilliance of the Seas departed its next port, a cloud of suspicion hung over it. Somewhere in the waters of the Aegean, George Smith had vanished. Whether he had stumbled drunkenly over the railing, been attacked by fellow passengers, or met some other sinister fate, no one could say with certainty. But the evidence left behind, the bloodstain, the noise, the unanswered questions, ensured that his disappearance would not fade quietly into the endless horizon. As the hours turned into days, the disappearance of George Smith gripped not only those aboard the Brilliance of the Seas, but also people across continents who followed the story through headlines and television coverage. International law enforcement stepped in quickly, but the investigation was anything but straightforward. The complexity of jurisdiction at sea meant that several authorities became involved: the FBI from the United States, Turkish police since the ship had docked in Turkey at the time, and Greek officials because the vessel had been sailing through Greek waters. Each agency brought its own methods and priorities, but none had clear authority. This confusion would haunt the case from the very beginning. Royal Caribbean, eager to protect its reputation, issued statements suggesting George's fall was accidental, the result of heavy drinking and misadventure. But the visible evidence contradicted this narrative. The large pool of blood on the lifeboat canopy was not what one expected from a simple tumble over the railing. Forensic experts later noted that the amount suggested significant injury before impact with the water, perhaps even inside the cabin or on the balcony itself. Such details fueled suspicion that foul play was involved. Attention soon turned to the men George had spent his final hours with: Josh Askin, Rusty Kaufman, and the Rosenberg cousins. These young men had a reputation on board. Passengers remembered their loud antics, their heavy drinking, and their aggressive style of partying. Witnesses reported seeing George leave the casino with them in the early hours of the morning. Some claimed the group guided him back toward his cabin, with George visibly intoxicated and unstable. What happened next became the central question of the investigation. According to some testimonies, loud noises, banging, furniture moving, and raised voices were heard from the Smiths' cabin after George returned. Neighbors described hearing what sounded like a scuffle. Some said they heard George's distinct voice shouting before everything fell silent. Others claimed they heard unfamiliar male voices lingering after. The implication was chilling. George may not have been alone in his final moments. Jennifer, meanwhile, was interrogated extensively. She explained that she had been escorted to the cabin by security in the early morning hours and had collapsed into bed, too intoxicated to know what happened afterward. She awoke to discover George missing and learned about the blood on the lifeboat canopy only when crew members began asking questions. Her statement seemed plausible, but investigators could not ignore the tension between her and George earlier in the night. Some speculated that the couple's arguments might have escalated violently, but no physical evidence tied Jennifer to any act of harm. Instead, suspicion gradually shifted back toward the group of men. The behavior of those men in the aftermath drew scrutiny. Other passengers reported overhearing them making cryptic or boastful comments. One account suggested they joked about George's disappearance, while another implied they had knowledge of what happened. Despite such reports, the men denied involvement and cooperated only minimally with investigators. Without conclusive forensic evidence linking them to a crime, authorities struggled to build a case. Adding to the mystery was the ship's handling of the situation. Royal Caribbean was criticized for not securing the scene immediately and for failing to preserve crucial evidence. Crew members reportedly cleaned parts of the cabin and balcony before law enforcement could conduct thorough examinations. This raised suspicions of a cover-up, with George's family later accusing the cruise line of prioritizing its public image over truth and justice. The cruise industry's reputation depended heavily on the perception of safety, and an unresolved disappearance during a honeymoon was a public relations disaster. The Smith family, devastated by George's disappearance, refused to accept the idea of an accident. His parents, George and Maureen, became vocal advocates for a deeper investigation. They pointed out that their son was healthy, adventurous, and had everything to live for. The blood evidence, combined with witness testimonies about noises and possible struggles, convinced them foul play was the only explanation. They accused Royal Caribbean of negligence and pressed the FBI to continue pursuing leads. The FBI did take the case seriously, interviewing witnesses and even seizing surveillance footage from the ship. Yet the footage proved less useful than hoped. Many cameras aboard the vessel were positioned in public spaces, and coverage of the cabin hallways was limited. The crucial moments when George returned to his room and whatever happened afterward were never captured. What might have been the strongest piece of evidence simply did not exist. Meanwhile, the media transformed the case into a sensation. Headlines described the disappearance as a honeymoon mystery, and television segments speculated endlessly about whether George fell, jumped, or was pushed. Jennifer became a subject of fascination. Some portrayed her as a grieving widow, while others cast suspicion, questioning her quick settlement with Royal Caribbean and her decision to later remarry. The scrutiny weighed heavily on her, but she maintained her innocence and insisted she wanted the truth as much as anyone. As the investigation dragged on, theories multiplied. Some believed George had drunkenly leaned over the balcony and fallen by accident, his death an unfortunate but explainable tragedy. Others were convinced he had been attacked, either during a robbery gone wrong or as the result of escalating tensions with the men he had been drinking with. A darker theory suggested he had been incapacitated or beaten before being pushed, with the blood evidence serving as proof of violence. None of these theories could be definitively proven, but each gained traction depending on which piece of evidence or testimony one emphasized. What was clear was that George's body was never recovered. The sea, vast and unforgiving, had swallowed any chance of retrieving him, and with it, the most direct evidence of how he died. Without a body, autopsy, or conclusive witness testimony, the investigation was left navigating shadows and speculation. Despite this, the Smith family persisted. They met with lawmakers, testified before congressional committees about safety on cruise ships, and pushed for reforms to address the lack of accountability in crimes at sea. Their campaign highlighted broader issues. Cruise lines often operated under foreign flags, meaning incidents were governed by complex webs of international law. Passengers frequently assumed they were protected by U.S. authorities, but in reality, jurisdiction could shift depending on where the ship was located, whose waters it sailed through, and where it was registered. George's disappearance became a case study in the difficulties of seeking justice when tragedy strikes far from shore. By late 2005 and into 2006, the case remained unresolved. The men who were last seen with George had returned home, beyond the easy reach of foreign investigators. Jennifer had moved forward with her life but faced criticism for a settlement with Royal Caribbean that George's family viewed as betrayal. The FBI kept the case open, occasionally re-interviewing witnesses, but progress was slow. The mystery of what happened aboard the Brilliance of the Seas continued to gnaw at all involved. Every unanswered question pointed back to that bloodstain on the lifeboat canopy, a silent witness to something violent and final. Was George assaulted in his cabin before being thrown over the railing? Did he stumble outside in a drunken haze, his fall made deadly by the height? Or was there something more sinister, a crime committed by men who believed the sea would erase their tracks? Without new evidence, investigators could only circle these questions, trapped by the limits of circumstance and jurisdiction. For George's family, each day without answers deepened their grief. They had sent their son on his honeymoon, never imagining he would not return. The photographs of him smiling on the cruise, the memories of his wedding, all became reminders of a life cut short and a mystery that refused to yield. By the time the first anniversary of George's disappearance arrived, the case had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about one man's fate, but about the broader dangers of unregulated waters, the failures of powerful corporations, and the fragility of justice when tragedy happens far from home. As months turned into years, the disappearance of George Smith IV remained suspended between mystery and tragedy, a case without closure that haunted everyone connected to it. The Smith family refused to let their son's memory fade, but with every passing season the likelihood of definitive answers diminished. The Mediterranean had kept its secret, and the world was left with fragments of evidence, conflicting testimonies, and the painful weight of uncertainty. The FBI maintained an open file, but progress was slow. Agents had gathered testimonies from passengers, reviewed surveillance footage, and tracked down the men last seen with George, but no charges were ever filed. There were whispers of sealed evidence, hints that some statements had been inconsistent, and suspicions that individuals may have known more than they revealed. Yet without a body, without conclusive forensic evidence, prosecutors lacked the foundation to pursue criminal indictments. The case hovered in limbo, technically active but effectively stalled. For George's parents, George and Maureen Smith, the lack of accountability was unbearable. They became tireless advocates, speaking publicly about their son's disappearance and accusing Royal Caribbean of negligence and cover-up. They argued that the cruise line had mishandled the investigation from the very beginning, cleaning parts of the cabin and failing to secure vital evidence. They believed that George had been the victim of a violent crime, and that corporate interests had taken precedence over justice. The Smiths' anguish became a voice for broader concerns about safety at sea. Jennifer, George's widow, faced her own struggles. Public opinion about her was divided, shaped heavily by media coverage that scrutinized her every decision. When she reached a settlement with Royal Caribbean in 2006, It was seen by some as a practical step to move forward with her life. To the Smith family, however, it felt like betrayal. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, limiting Jennifer's ability to speak about the case publicly, and provided financial compensation that critics claimed silenced her too quickly. The divide between Jennifer and George's parents deepened, turning private grief into a public rift. Meanwhile, the men who had been with George on the final night of his life returned to their homes in the United States. Their names remained tied to the case, mentioned in articles and television specials, but none of them faced legal consequences. Each denied wrongdoing. Some cooperated with investigators, others less so, but none admitted to having any part in George's disappearance. For many observers, this was the most frustrating aspect of the case, that there were individuals who may have held answers, yet the legal system could not compel them into accountability without stronger evidence. Theories continued to swirl. Some believed George had been the victim of a robbery that escalated, perhaps when he flaunted winnings from the casino. Others thought he had been assaulted in a drunken altercation, incapacitated, and then pushed overboard. A few clung to the possibility of a tragic accident, though the blood evidence seemed inconsistent with a simple fall. With no definitive proof, every possibility remained open, and speculation became part of the story itself. The media kept the case alive, especially in the years immediately following the disappearance. Television networks produced documentaries and true crime specials, each piecing together timelines and interviews, trying to reconstruct the lost hours of that fateful night. Images of George and Jennifer smiling on their honeymoon were juxtaposed with shots of the blood-stained lifeboat canopy, a stark reminder of how quickly joy had turned to horror. Viewers were drawn to the mystery, but for the Smith family, each broadcast was another reminder of the pain they lived daily. The broader impact of the case reached beyond the individuals involved. Lawmakers in the United States took notice, as the Smiths and other families affected by cruise ship crimes testified before Congress. They highlighted the lack of regulation and oversight in international waters, where ships often sailed under foreign flags to avoid strict accountability. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010 was one result, requiring cruise lines to improve reporting of crimes, install better security measures, and preserve evidence in cases of disappearance or assault. George's case became a driving force behind these reforms, ensuring that his story would contribute to protecting future passengers, even if it could not bring him back. For Royal Caribbean, the disappearance was a public relations nightmare. The company insisted it had cooperated with investigators and maintained that George's fall was likely accidental. But the persistence of the Smith family and the media's fascination meant the company could never fully escape the shadow of suspicion. The idea that a passenger could vanish under such violent-seeming circumstances, with so little resolution, raised doubts about safety across the entire cruise industry. As the years went on, the case settled into the category of unresolved mysteries. Every so often, new attention would flare. An anniversary, a documentary, a statement from the family, or a rumor of fresh evidence. But no breakthrough ever came. The FBI kept the case technically open, but insiders admitted it was dormant, lacking the leads that could reignite it. George's parents continued to hope that someone, someday, would speak out with the truth. They believed that secrets were being kept, and that silence was protecting the guilty. Jennifer rebuilt her life, eventually remarrying, but she would always be tied to the tragedy. For some, she remained a figure of suspicion. For others, she was simply a woman who had suffered a loss under unimaginable circumstances. She rarely spoke publicly about George after the settlement, bound by legal agreements and perhaps by her own need to move forward. The fracture between her and the Smith family never healed. For those who studied the case, certain images remained seared in memory. The young couple smiling on the deck of the ship, the rowdy group of men in the casino, the lifeboat canopy stained deep red against the white of the ship, and the endless expanse of the Aegean Sea where George's body was lost. These fragments told a story, but never the full one. The silence of the sea had swallowed the final chapter. Today, the disappearance of George Smith IV remains one of the most infamous unsolved cases in maritime history. It stands as a reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist on cruise ships, places where jurisdiction is blurred, and where crimes can be hidden beneath the surface of waves. It also stands as a personal tragedy, the story of a young man who set out on his honeymoon and never returned, of parents who fought tirelessly for answers, of a widow left in an impossible position, and of companions whose role in that night remains clouded in suspicion. The legacy of the case is dual. On one side, it is a story of loss without closure, of a family left with endless questions. On the other, it is a story that spurred change, leading to greater protections for travelers and awareness of the dangers that can lurk in places marketed as paradises. Yet for those closest to George, the reforms and the headlines could never replace the simple truth they sought. What really happened in those final hours aboard the brilliance of the seas? Years later, when George's parents reflected on their son, they spoke not only of the mystery but of the man he was, the laughter he brought to friends, the warmth he shared with family, and the dreams he carried into his marriage. They wanted him remembered not just as a victim of an unsolved case, but as a vibrant young man whose life had been stolen by forces still unnamed. Their voices carried the hope that, someday, the silence would break, and someone would step forward to give them the truth that the sea had denied. Until that day, the story remained suspended, adrift like the ship itself on that summer night, caught between light and darkness, joy and tragedy, love and loss. The disappearance of George Smith IV is not only a crime story but a haunting reminder of how quickly life can change, and how some mysteries, no matter how deeply investigated, may never yield their final answers. A dream honeymoon in paradise turned into a chilling nightmare. In Fiji's crystal blue waters, love and trust collapsed in a single night of violence. What began as celebration ended in tragedy, leaving haunting questions behind. This is the story of betrayal, escape, and justice that shocked the world. The summer of 2022 was meant to mark the beginning of a lifelong journey for Bradley Robert Dawson and Chris Chun. They had married only a few months earlier in a small, cheerful ceremony attended by friends and family in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a wedding filled with laughter, hope, and the promise of a future together. Their honeymoon was supposed to be the perfect chapter to start that new life. A trip to Fiji, a place known for turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and the sense of untouched paradise. For Chris, it was a dream destination, and for Bradley, it was a chance to impress his new bride with the romantic adventure she had always envisioned. Yet, within days, that promise of joy would unravel in a way no one could have foreseen. Bradley Dawson was a 38-year-old IT professional working at Youth Villages, a nonprofit in Tennessee focused on helping children and families in need. He had a reputation at work for being soft-spoken and reliable, someone who blended into the background without drawing too much attention. Colleagues described him as quiet but polite, the kind of man who enjoyed cycling and spending time outdoors. He was not the type anyone would expect to be at the center of an international murder case. To those who knew him, he appeared like an ordinary man leading an ordinary life. Chris Chen, on the other hand, was vibrant and full of energy. At 36, she had built a respected career as a pharmacist in Memphis, where her patients and co-workers admired her dedication. She had an infectious smile, and friends often recalled how she brought warmth into every room she entered. Born to Chinese immigrant parents, Christ was their only child, and they were proud of her accomplishments, both professional and personal. She had a deep love for her family and looked forward to the life ahead. Marriage, children, and perhaps one day owning her own pharmacy. In Bradley, she believed she had found someone who shared her dreams of building a life together. When the couple boarded their flight to Fiji in early July 2022, they appeared like any other honeymooners. Excited, hopeful, and perhaps slightly exhausted from the whirlwind of a wedding. They checked into Turtle Island Resort, a luxury retreat famous for hosting celebrities and offering seclusion in breathtaking surroundings. For many, the resort was a paradise. But behind the smiles and photographs taken during their first days on the island, there were already cracks forming in the picture-perfect image of their marriage. Witnesses later recalled that Bradley and Chris sometimes argued after drinking. What might have seemed like small disagreements in public hinted at deeper tension between them. Still, No one could have predicted the horror that would unfold on the night of July 9th. That evening, guests at the resort remembered hearing raised voices from the couple's villa. It was not unusual for newlyweds to have disagreements, but what they heard was different. Loud, heated, and alarming. After a while, the shouting stopped, and silence fell over the villa. Most guests thought little of it, assuming the couple had resolved their dispute. But in reality, a violent tragedy had occurred behind those closed doors. Sometime during that night, the argument escalated beyond control. In a fit of rage, Bradley attacked Christ. The details of what happened in those crucial minutes remain partially unclear, but the autopsy later revealed that Christ had suffered fatal blunt force trauma to the head. The woman who had dreamed of building a life with the man she had just married was left lifeless on the floor of their villa. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Instead of seeking help or reporting the incident, Bradley fled. In the darkness, he took a kayak from the resort and attempted to escape across the waters to a nearby island. His decision to flee painted a chilling picture of guilt and desperation. For hours, he drifted and paddled, moving away from the paradise that had now turned into a crime scene. The following morning, staff at Turtle Island discovered Christ's body. News spread quickly among the other guests, many of whom were horrified at the thought that such violence had occurred in a place designed for love and serenity. Police were notified immediately, and a manhunt was launched for Bradley Dawson. The case, shocking in its brutality, was already drawing international attention. It did not take long for authorities to locate him. Bradley was found in a village on a nearby island, exhausted and disoriented from his escape attempt. He was taken into custody and brought back to face questioning. At first, he denied responsibility, suggesting Christ's death had been an accident. But forensic evidence told a different story. The injuries were too severe, too deliberate to be dismissed as a mistake. Back in the United States, news of the murder stunned both families. For Christ's parents, the call from Fiji was the kind of nightmare no parent should ever endure. Their only daughter, their pride and joy, had been taken from them in the most violent way imaginable. They had sent her off to start a new chapter in life, never expecting it would end so soon and so cruelly. For Bradley's family, the arrest was equally shocking. They could not reconcile the man they knew, the quiet software engineer, the brother and son, with the accusations being made against him. Media coverage quickly intensified. Headlines described it as the Blue Lagoon honeymoon murder, a story so tragic and surreal it seemed like fiction. But for those closest to the couple, it was painfully real. Christ's friends mourned the loss of a woman they described as compassionate and full of promise. Her patients in Memphis spoke about the pharmacist who had cared for them with kindness and professionalism. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, a portrait of the marriage emerged that was far more complicated than it had appeared from the outside. Though they had only been married a few months, there were signs of incompatibility and tension that had perhaps been ignored in the rush toward matrimony. Those tensions exploded in Fiji, leaving behind devastating consequences. When Bradley Robert Dawson was taken into custody by Fijian authorities, the image of the quiet, soft-spoken IT professional who had traveled to paradise for a honeymoon shattered completely. Handcuffed and exhausted after his attempted escape across the lagoon, he looked more like a man cornered by the weight of his choices than a newlywed on the trip of a lifetime. Local officers described him as cooperative yet evasive, answering questions with half-truths and vague statements. His initial claim was that Christ's death was a terrible accident, but the bruises, the blunt force trauma, and the panic of his midnight flight painted an entirely different picture. The investigation in Fiji moved quickly, partly because of the resort's high profile. Turtle Island had hosted celebrities, politicians, and wealthy honeymooners from across the world, and the news that a bride had been beaten to death in her villa threatened the image of safety that the resort relied upon. Police secured the crime scene, interviewing staff members and guests who had been staying nearby. Several witnesses remembered hearing heated arguments the night of July 9th, voices rising and then abruptly falling into silence. The sound of shouting followed by nothing at all became one of the case's most haunting details. Forensic teams documented the scene meticulously. Blood evidence, the condition of the villa, and Christ's injuries all pointed to intentional violence rather than an accident. The autopsy confirmed that she had suffered severe head trauma, injuries that could not be explained by a simple fall or stumble. The conclusion was clear. Christ had been violently assaulted, and the man she had trusted with her future was now accused of ending her life. As news traveled across the Pacific, American media outlets seized on the story. The idea of a honeymoon-turned homicide was gripping, tragic, and shocking. In Memphis, Christ's colleagues and friends were stunned. They remembered her enthusiasm for life, her commitment to her patients, and the joy she had expressed about her marriage. The fact that she had been killed by her husband, on what should have been the most romantic trip of her life, was almost impossible for them to comprehend. Her parents flew to Fiji, their grief compounded by the distance and the unfamiliar legal system in which their daughter's case was now entangled. They had not only lost their only child, but were forced to relive the horror through press coverage and courtroom updates. At every step, they carried photos of Christ, determined that the world remember her as more than a victim of spousal violence. To them, she was still the girl who had grown up surrounded by love, a woman who wanted to build her own family, and a daughter whose future had been stolen. On the other side of the ocean, Bradley's family in Tennessee also struggled to process the news. They described him as calm, private, and incapable of such violence. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Their son, brother, and colleague had been found fleeing the scene of his wife's murder in a stolen kayak. The weight of the facts contradicted the picture they had carried of him for years. As the Fijian courts prepared to hear the case, the world watched closely. International crime cases often draw attention, but this one, with its striking juxtaposition of paradise and brutality, became a symbol of how quickly love can twist into something deadly. Reporters swarmed the hearings, capturing images of Bradley in plain clothing, his head bowed, eyes downcast, while prosecutors laid out the forensic evidence in painstaking detail. The defense attempted to frame the killing as accidental, suggesting that an argument between the couple had escalated unintentionally. Bradley himself maintained that he loved his wife, that he never intended harm, and that her death had been a tragic mistake. But prosecutors countered with the physical evidence, the autopsy's findings of multiple blows, the nature of her injuries, and the absence of any effort to seek help. Instead of calling for assistance or alerting the resort, Bradley had chosen to run. That choice, prosecutors argued, spoke louder than any of his words. Witnesses described Christ as joyful in the early days of the honeymoon, but also noted signs of tension between her and Bradley after nights of drinking. Their marriage, though fresh, already carried cracks, and in the confines of the secluded resort, those fractures had widened dramatically. The picture painted in court was not one of a fairy tale honeymoon but of a relationship that had turned toxic under the surface, erupting violently when stress, alcohol, and emotions collided. For the Fijian justice system, the case represented both a tragedy and a responsibility. They needed to ensure justice for Christ, while also demonstrating to the international community that serious crimes would be pursued with rigor on their islands. The courtroom scenes were solemn, each hearing attended by grieving parents, stunned onlookers, and a press corps eager for every detail. Throughout the proceedings, Bradley displayed little visible emotion. Some observers interpreted this as coldness, while others saw it as shock. His flat demeanor only fueled the perception that he lacked remorse, further hardening public opinion against him. Meanwhile, Christ's parents listened to the forensic descriptions with tears in their eyes, reliving the last moments of their daughter's life in excruciating detail. As weeks turned into months, the case became a point of reflection for many. In Tennessee, some of Bradley's co-workers and friends admitted they had never truly known him, questioning how someone so seemingly ordinary could harbor the capacity for such violence. In Memphis, Christ's patients and colleagues set up memorials, remembering her as a woman who had dedicated herself to helping others, even as her own life had been cruelly taken. When the verdict finally arrived in April 2024, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The High Court of Fiji delivered its judgment. Bradley Robert Dawson was guilty of murder. The sentence was life imprisonment with a minimum of 18 years before the possibility of parole. The decision marked the end of a legal journey but not the end of the grief that lingered for Krist's loved ones. For her parents, the ruling was a measure of justice, but no sentence could bring back their daughter. They spoke afterward about the emptiness of losing their only child, about how every holiday, every family gathering, would now carry the shadow of her absence. For Bradley's family, the sentence was devastating in a different way. They had lost him, too, not to death, but to a lifetime behind bars in a foreign country. The courtroom scenes closed a chapter in the public eye, but the story continued to echo far beyond the walls of the Fijian court. The case was discussed in true crime forums, covered in documentaries, and debated in legal circles. It became a cautionary tale about the fragility of relationships and the unpredictable nature of violence, even in the most idyllic settings. The Blue Lagoon honeymoon murder was no longer just a headline. It had become a symbol of broken promises, of a life cut short, and of the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. For those who knew Krist, it was a personal tragedy that no sentence could erase. For those who knew Bradley, it was a revelation that the man they thought they understood was capable of unimaginable darkness. The courtroom verdict marked the end of the legal process, but the story of the Blue Lagoon honeymoon murder did not end with Bradley Dawson's sentence. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a much longer reckoning for both families, for the friends left behind, and for a wider public that followed the case with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The serene backdrop of Fiji had become forever tied to a crime that would echo far beyond the islands, haunting those who tried to make sense of how a dream trip could spiral into such devastation. In Memphis, the community that knew Krist Chun struggled with the suddenness of her loss. Pharmacies where she had worked placed her photo on counters, a gesture of remembrance for a woman who had been more than just a dispenser of medicine. She had been a confidant to patients, a source of comfort for those navigating illness, and a friend to colleagues who admired her work ethic. For them, her absence was not just the absence of a smiling face, but of genuine compassion that touched countless lives. Vigils were held in her memory, with candles lit and tears shed as friends described her as a woman full of energy and kindness, someone who seemed destined to make a difference in every space she entered. Her parents remained the most visibly devastated. As their only child, Krist had been the center of their world. In interviews, they described the emptiness of returning home without her, of waking each day to the reminder that the daughter they had raised with such care and pride would never return. They carried her memory into the courtroom and into the public eye, ensuring she was never reduced to just a victim's name in a headline. For them, justice had been served, but peace was elusive. Grief had settled in like an uninvited guest that would never leave. For Bradley's family in Tennessee, the reality of his conviction was equally crushing. They had watched the story unfold with disbelief, clinging to the image of the quiet son and brother they thought they knew. Reconciling that man with the killer described in court was almost impossible. They faced judgment from their community, whispered questions about how such violence could emerge from within their family. Their pain was not only in losing him to prison but also in carrying the stigma of his actions. In their eyes, the Bradley they loved seemed to have vanished long before the verdict. The international coverage of the case turned the Blue Lagoon murder into a global cautionary tale. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials dissected every detail. Viewers were drawn to the paradox. A Paradise Island honeymoon ending in a brutal killing. The contrast was too sharp, too surreal to ignore. The case became one of those tragedies that lingered in public memory, not only for its violence but also for the unsettling reminder that appearances can mask dangerous truths. Behind the smiling wedding photos and the picturesque honeymoon snapshots, there had been cracks, and those cracks widened fatally. Legal analysts reflected on the broader implications. In cases of spousal violence, there are often subtle signs, arguments, controlling behavior, or emotional strain that are overlooked or minimized until it is too late. Krist and Bradley's story fit this tragic pattern. Friends recalled tension in their relationship, but no one imagined it would escalate into lethal violence. The lesson echoed across discussions. Domestic violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it emerges quietly, only revealing its true danger when it is far too late. The resort itself, Turtle Island, also bore the weight of the crime. Known as a sanctuary of peace and exclusivity, it now carried the shadow of a murder within its villas. While the management expressed condolences and cooperated fully with the investigation, the incident inevitably tarnished the resort's image. For future guests, the paradise would always be haunted by the knowledge that it had once been the site of a young bride's violent death. As months passed, the story shifted from the immediacy of the trial to the longer reflections on what it meant. True crime enthusiasts dissected the details, but for the people directly involved, it was not an intellectual exercise. For Christ's parents, every retelling was another wound. They wanted her remembered not for the horror of her final moments, but for the life she had lived, her generosity, her dreams, her dedication. They began speaking about her publicly, not to relive the tragedy, but to preserve her memory in a way that outshone the darkness. For Bradley, life behind bars in Fiji was a stark contrast to the life he had once lived. A man who had worked in technology, surrounded by the comforts of suburban America, was now confined to a cell thousands of miles away from home. Accounts of his time in prison painted a picture of isolation and resignation. He continued to maintain that he had not intended to kill his wife, but such statements rang hollow in the face of the evidence. The reality was clear. His choices had ended one life and destroyed many others, including his own. The case also raised questions about the nature of love and trust. How could two people, bound together in marriage and embarking on a honeymoon, reach a point of such catastrophic violence? The answers were complex and elusive. Some pointed to alcohol, others to unresolved tensions, and others still to deeper issues of control and incompatibility. But in the end, no explanation could fully account for the brutality of the act or the emptiness it left behind. In the years to come, the Blue Lagoon murder will likely be remembered as one of the most haunting examples of a honeymoon tragedy. It sits alongside a handful of other notorious cases where love and violence collided in shocking ways. Yet for those closest to Christ, the memory is not part of a genre or a headline. It is personal. Her parents, her friends, her patients, and her community remember a woman with an open heart and a bright future, stolen by the very person she had trusted most. As the world moves on, the lessons of the case remain. It is a reminder that violence can lurk even in the most unexpected places, that paradise can conceal horror, and that relationships are not always as they appear from the outside. The story is not just about the crime itself, but about the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of choices made in anger. In the end, what was meant to be the happiest journey of two lives intertwined became a cautionary tale retold around the world. The island paradise of Fiji, the wedding vows spoken in joy, the honeymoon dreams. All of it dissolved into silence that night in July 2022. For Christ, her story ended too soon. Her life cut short by the man who had promised to cherish her. For Bradley, his story continues in confinement, defined forever by the crime he committed. For the rest of us, it remains a chilling reminder that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can intrude, leaving behind a tragedy that time cannot erase. In the heart of Utah's desert paradise, a newlywed couple's dream honeymoon turned into a chilling nightmare. Two women, deeply in love, vanished without a trace, only to be found brutally murdered. What followed was a haunting mystery, unanswered questions, and a shocking truth that stunned the world. In the summer of 2021, the small desert community of Moab, Utah, was alive with its usual blend of travelers, campers, and locals who thrived on the area's rugged beauty. Surrounded by towering red rock cliffs, winding rivers, and the vast openness of the La Salle Mountains, Moab carried a sense of safety and freedom that drew in adventurers from all over the country. It was the kind of place where strangers quickly became friends, where travelers found refuge, and where the idea of danger felt like a distant possibility. Yet, in August of that year, the quiet harmony of this desert haven was shattered by a crime so senseless and brutal that it left an indelible scar on the town's soul. At the heart of this tragedy were two women, newly married and deeply in love, whose lives were cruelly cut short: Keelan Carol Schultz and Crystal Michelle Turner. Keelan was just 24 years old, a young woman whose spirit seemed tailor-made for a life of adventure. Born in Montana, she was raised in a family that instilled in her a strong sense of community and connection. Those who knew her best described her as a free spirit, someone who carried light into every room she entered. She loved the outdoors, thrived in wide open spaces, and found peace in the rhythm of nature. There was a kindness in her demeanor that made people feel instantly at ease, and she had the rare ability to make even a passing encounter feel meaningful. Her friends would later remember her not only for her laughter and creativity, but also for the way she treated people with genuine compassion. Crystal, at 38 years old, came from a different background but shared the same thirst for freedom that had drawn her to Moab. Originally from Arkansas, she had spent much of her life working hard and building resilience in the face of challenges. She carried herself with quiet strength, often described as the protector in her relationship with Keelan. To those around her, Crystal was dependable, caring, and fiercely loyal to the people she loved. Her connection with Keelan was rooted in mutual respect and admiration, a love story that blossomed despite their age difference. Together, they radiated authenticity. Two women unafraid to live life on their own terms, camping under the stars, traveling lightly, and finding joy in experiences rather than possessions. Their relationship was more than just a union. It was a journey. They had married only months before the events that would ultimately claim their lives, embarking on what should have been a time filled with joy and discovery. Their choice to live a nomadic lifestyle was not just about escape, but about fully embracing freedom, working seasonal jobs in Moab, pitching their tent or van wherever they felt most at home, and immersing themselves in the natural beauty of Utah's Red Rock country. They were, in many ways, emblematic of the new generation of wanderers who valued simplicity, adventure, and connection above material wealth. In the days leading up to their disappearance, the couple was seen around town, working their shifts and spending time with friends. They had mentioned a growing unease at their campsite, speaking specifically of a man who had unsettled them with his presence. They described him as creepy, an unsettling figure who seemed to hover too close for comfort. Friends recalled how the couple mentioned feeling watched, a detail that would later take on chilling significance. Despite this discomfort, Keelan and Crystal tried to maintain their routines, as though hoping the unease would pass. Their decision to remain at their campsite in the La Salle Mountains reflected both their determination to hold on to their way of life and perhaps a belief that danger was unlikely to intrude so violently in their small corner of the world. When the couple failed to appear for work in mid-August, alarms began to sound within their circle of friends and colleagues. It was unusual for them to disappear without explanation, and even more unusual for them to leave their commitments unattended. Concern quickly escalated to fear as days passed without word from either woman. Friends organized searches, scouring the areas where they were known to camp, reaching out to law enforcement, and spreading word across the community. The disappearance of Keelan and Crystal rippled through Moab, igniting a sense of dread in a town unaccustomed to violent crime. The search ended with a devastating discovery. Their bodies were found at their campsite in the La Salle Mountains, just a short drive from town. Both women had been shot multiple times. The scene was harrowing, a stark contrast to the life of peace and freedom they had built together. For their families, the news was unbearable, and for the community, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. This was not an accident, nor a tragedy born of the elements. It was deliberate, violent, and personal. The murders carried the unmistakable mark of someone who had stalked or targeted them, and investigators quickly recognized that this was no random act of cruelty. As word spread, the detail about the creepy man resurfaced in conversations and witness accounts. The couple had confided about him just days before they were killed, raising the possibility that their fears had been justified. This revelation amplified the terror within Moab, suggesting that someone lurking in the desert had preyed upon them. The town, usually filled with travelers and wanderers, now viewed outsiders with suspicion, and residents began locking doors, looking over shoulders, and avoiding the once welcoming wilderness. The timing of the murders added another layer of intrigue and confusion. Only days earlier, Moab had been thrust into national headlines when police stopped Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, after a domestic dispute near Arches National Park. The coincidence of two high-profile cases involving couples in such a small town led to widespread speculation. Could there be a connection? Was there a predator stalking campers and travelers in the area? Investigators quickly dismissed a link between the two cases, but the rumors persisted, feeding the growing anxiety. For the families of Keelan and Crystal, grief was accompanied by questions. Who could have committed such an act of brutality? Why target two women who were known for their kindness, whose lives were marked by love and peace rather than conflict? In the absence of answers, theories swirled, but nothing could fill the void left behind by their absence. The campsite where they had lived and loved became a crime scene, and the desert that once represented freedom now symbolized loss. In the weeks that followed, vigils were held, candles lit, and memories shared. Friends and family spoke of their laughter, their dreams, and the life they had built together, a life stolen far too soon. The tragedy bound the community together in grief but also left behind a lingering fear. For Moab, a place where people came to escape, the reality of violence had arrived in the most unimaginable way. And as investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, one haunting question loomed. Who was the man behind this senseless act, and why did he target Keelan and Crystal on what should have been the happiest journey of their lives? The discovery of Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner's bodies in the La Salle Mountains shook Moab to its core, and what followed was a tense and uncertain investigation that stretched on far longer than anyone could have imagined. In those early days, law enforcement faced an overwhelming challenge. Two victims, a remote campsite, little evidence left behind, and a terrified community demanding answers. The isolation of the crime scene made things more complicated. Nature itself, rain, wind, and animals, had already disturbed the site, limiting the amount of forensic evidence investigators could collect. Despite the difficulties, the Grand County Sheriff's Office, along with state and federal agencies, poured resources into the case, determined to find the person responsible for this heinous act. As detectives combed through the evidence, one chilling detail stood out above all others. The testimony from friends that Keelan and Crystal had spoken of a creepy man lurking near their campsite days before their murders. This account, vague yet deeply unsettling, immediately pointed to the likelihood of stalking. The couple had reportedly even considered moving their camp because of this individual, but tragically, they never got the chance. The vague description provided no identity, no physical characteristics, only the sense of unease the man created. Investigators knew this could be the key to the case, but tracking down a stranger in an area as vast as Moab's wilderness was like searching for a shadow in the desert. The murders drew widespread attention not only because of the brutality but also because of timing. The town of Moab was already under national scrutiny following the highly publicized police stop of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, which had taken place just days earlier. The overlap fueled speculation across the internet and media outlets. Could Gabby's fiancé, later revealed as her killer, somehow be linked to Keelan and Crystal's deaths? Theories spiraled out of control, and law enforcement found themselves battling not only the absence of hard leads but also a flood of misinformation. Officials were quick to clarify that the two cases were unrelated, but public suspicion persisted. The idea of multiple killers operating in the same small town was too haunting for some to ignore, and the overlap only intensified the pressure on investigators. In the weeks after the murders, law enforcement interviewed dozens of people, ranging from fellow campers to locals who had crossed paths with the couple. They scrutinized known offenders in the area and looked into anyone with a history of violence or stalking. Yet each lead seemed to dry up as quickly as it surfaced. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was reviewed, phone records checked, and possible suspects interrogated. Despite these efforts, the investigation dragged forward without a breakthrough. The lack of answers left Keelan and Crystal's families in limbo, forced to endure the agony of not only losing their loved ones but also not knowing why or by whose hand. As weeks turned into months, the case took on a haunting stillness. For Moab, a town where crime was generally low and violent acts rare, the weight of an unsolved double homicide was crushing. Families who once felt secure leaving their doors unlocked began to double-check locks at night. Hikers and campers, once carefree in the wilderness, moved with a heightened sense of caution, glancing over shoulders and choosing campsites closer to others rather than in isolation. The presence of fear was everywhere, replacing the trust and openness that had long defined the town. Keelan and Crystal's names became synonymous with the fragility of safety, their story retold in whispers among locals and dissected endlessly on true crime forums across the internet. Meanwhile, the families of the victims continued to push for answers. Keelan's father, in particular, became a voice of both grief and determination. He spoke out about his daughter, reminding the public that she was more than a victim. She was a vibrant young woman with dreams, with love, with a life unfairly stolen. Crystal's loved ones echoed the same sentiment, emphasizing her kindness and the happiness she had found in her relationship with Keelan. For the families, justice was not only about identifying the killer but also about ensuring that the lives of their loved ones were honored and remembered. They attended vigils, shared their memories with the press, and worked tirelessly to keep the story alive in the media, fearing that silence might allow the case to fade into obscurity. In the absence of official answers, speculation thrived. Some locals whispered about drifters passing through town, others about disgruntled acquaintances. Rumors painted pictures of jealous ex-partners or strangers with dark motives. Still others held onto the image of the creepy man, convinced he was the key, though no one could say exactly who he was or why he had targeted the couple. The uncertainty gnawed at the community, and every unfamiliar face in Moab seemed, for a time, to carry suspicion. For investigators, the frustration grew. They knew that cases like this, without clear suspects, risked going cold. Yet they continued to pursue leads, to revisit interviews, and to pore over the evidence, hoping that something, anything, would point them in the right direction. The weight of responsibility was immense. 2 women had been murdered in their town, and justice was owed not only to them but to their grieving families. As months turned into a year, the silence around the case became deafening. Still, law enforcement quietly continued their work, reviewing forensic data, re-examining evidence, and waiting for the one break that might finally unlock the truth. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated about a potential suspect, someone who had left Moab shortly after the murders, a man with connections to the couple through their workplace. But without concrete proof, investigators could not move forward publicly. The shadow of the unsolved murders hung heavy over Moab. The town that once prided itself on its sense of openness and welcome now carried a scar, a lingering reminder of what had been taken from them. For Keelan and Crystal's loved ones, the waiting was unbearable. They clung to memories, photographs, and the love the couple had shared, even as the unanswered questions tore at them daily. Who had done this? Why had they done it? And would justice ever come? As the investigation stretched on, Moab lived with the weight of absence. 2 women who had embraced life and each other so fully were gone, and the community that had once been their home was left haunted by silence. It would not be until the following year that the quiet persistence of investigators, paired with the unraveling of a hidden confession, would bring the answers everyone had been desperate to hear. But in those long months of waiting, Moab was a town in mourning, and the story of Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner was one of love lost to violence, with justice still just out of reach. The long silence surrounding the murders of Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner finally began to break as investigators pieced together fragments of information that had once seemed inconsequential. For more than a year, the case had remained suspended in uncertainty, clouded by rumors, unanswered questions, and the haunting memory of 2 women whose lives had been stolen. But slowly, through persistence and careful attention to overlooked details, a picture began to form, and it pointed toward a man who had once crossed paths with the couple in seemingly ordinary circumstances. His name was Adam Pinkasiewicz. Adam was 45 years old, a man whose life was marked by instability and quiet resentment. He had worked briefly at the same McDonald's where Crystal was employed, giving him direct though limited contact with the couple. Colleagues described him as someone who kept to himself, a loner who carried a kind of bitterness in his demeanor. He was not widely known in Moab, nor was he part of the tight-knit community that surrounded Keelan and Crystal. But his presence was noted just enough that, in the wake of the murders, whispers about him began to surface. Shortly after the killings, he abruptly left town, vanishing from the area without explanation. For investigators, this detail alone raised alarms. A man who had known the victims, however casually, and who had disappeared without a trace soon after their deaths was too significant to ignore. It was only later that the most damning information came to light. Pinkesiewicz had allegedly confessed to someone about killing the two women. According to reports, he described the crime in unsettling detail before ultimately taking his own life in 2021, not long after the murders. At first, this account was little more than a whisper. Unverified, impossible to pin down, but as investigators revisited leads and reevaluated the case, they began to realize that this confession was not just rumor. Evidence linked him more concretely to the scene, though officials have never revealed every piece of proof, citing privacy for the families and the fact that the perpetrator was already deceased. Still, by December 2022, law enforcement had gathered enough to close the case and publicly name Adam Pinkesiewicz as the man responsible for the double homicide that had haunted Moab. The announcement brought both relief and devastation. For the families of Keelan and Crystal, there was a measure of closure in finally knowing the name of the person who had taken their loved ones' lives. But there was no trial, no opportunity to see justice carried out in a courtroom, and no chance to ask the question that lingered most heavily. Why? The motive behind Pinkesiewicz's actions remains unclear to this day. Some have speculated that he harbored personal animosity toward the couple, perhaps born out of resentment or prejudice. Others believe his actions were fueled by deeper psychological issues, festering in the isolation he carried within himself. Whatever the truth, the absence of a definitive motive has left an emptiness that no official closure could fully resolve. For Moab, the revelation was both shocking and sobering. The town had spent over a year under the shadow of uncertainty, its residents wary of strangers and fearful that a predator might still be lurking in the desert. To learn that the killer had been a man who had already left the community and who had ended his own life meant that the danger was gone. But it also reinforced the fragility of safety. If someone like Pinkesiewicz, quiet and overlooked, could harbor such violence, how could anyone be certain of true security? The case became not just about two lives lost, but about the shattering of innocence in a place where people had once believed themselves immune to such horrors. The families of Keelan and Crystal continued to grieve openly, their voices carrying the legacy of the women they loved. Keelan's father, speaking to media outlets, described his daughter's zest for life, her passion for nature, and the bond she shared with Crystal. He emphasized that though justice was incomplete, her story would live on through the memories of those who knew her. Crystal's loved ones echoed this, remembering her as a protector and as someone who found happiness in the simplicity of love and companionship. Together, the two women had built a life rooted in freedom and authenticity, and that life, though cut tragically short, stood as a testament to their courage in living true to themselves. In the aftermath of the case's closure, the community sought to heal. Vigils were held, murals painted, and spaces created where memories of the couple could be preserved. The story of Keelan and Crystal resonated far beyond Moab, touching people across the country who saw in their tragedy a reflection of vulnerability, love, and the cruel randomness of violence. For many, their deaths became a reminder of how quickly joy can turn into grief, and how even in the most serene of landscapes, darkness can intrude. True crime communities followed the case closely, not only because of its proximity to the Gabby Petito case, but because it encapsulated so many themes: love, freedom, fear, and the search for justice. Yet, despite the closure, the unanswered questions linger. What drove Adam Pinkesiewicz to commit such an act? Was it targeted hatred, personal resentment, or simply an eruption of violence from a troubled mind? Why had he chosen that moment, that couple, that night? With his death, those answers died as well, leaving behind only speculation and an unfillable void. For the families, this lack of explanation is perhaps the most painful part. Knowing the name of the killer provides some solace, but not knowing the why ensures the wound never fully heals. As time moves forward, the legacy of Keelan and Crystal continues to shape conversations in Moab and beyond. They are remembered not just as victims, but as women who dared to live authentically, who embraced a life of simplicity and adventure, and who loved each other without hesitation. Their story is retold at gatherings, in articles, and in the quiet spaces where people honor their memory. Though the crime that ended their lives was brutal, their legacy remains one of love, a legacy stronger than the violence that sought to erase it. For the people of Moab, the desert has begun to reclaim its silence, but it is a different kind of quiet than before. The beauty of the Red Rock Cliffs, the stillness of the La Salle Mountains, and the serenity of the rivers now hold within them the echoes of two lives stolen. The community moves forward with resilience, but the memory of August 2021 lingers, a reminder of vulnerability in a place once thought immune. And for the families who lost Keelan and Crystal, the passage of time will never erase the ache of absence, though it may carry forward the enduring love that defined their lives. The story of Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner is not one that ends neatly with the naming of their killer. It remains open in the questions left behind, in the love that endures despite loss, and in the community forever changed by their absence. It is a reminder that behind every headline, every case, and every tragedy are human beings whose lives ripple outward long after they are gone. In their laughter, in their courage, and in the love they shared, Keelan and Crystal remain present. Their honeymoon was cut short, their journey ended by violence, but their story continues to live on, haunting, heartbreaking, and deeply human.